now I'd like to introduce Frank Crary. He's going to talk about planetary CubeSats, nanosatellites, and subspacecraft.
Okay. Which is the others. Okay. I should say this is a perspective from a planetary scientist about CubeSats. So I'm actually going to be telling people who know more about CubeSats than I do what I think they're all about. However, I want to see, what you can do in terms of planetary science with CubeSats. And, well, you all know it's been, over the past few years, become more and more a topic of interest to a whole lot of people. But every time I hear talks, even the ones we've heard today, I'm not sure if we're talking about the same thing, because everything in sort of the mass range associated with a nanosatellite isn't really a CubeSat. And I really get the impression that although people think that 10 by 10 by 10 times some number of units is the defining factor, it actually doesn't strike me as the most important thing about CubeSats. So I want to talk about what I think the characteristics that define a CubeSat are and how that applies to doing planetary science. Now, to start off, what I've seen from the larger major NASA missions, planetary missions, is a lot of things are really driven by the infrequency of flight opportunities. And when you're talking about a mission to another planet as opposed to an asteroid or the moon, it's possible there's one destination that there are places where they'll only send a spacecraft once in someone's career. There are some places where it might be none at all. And that means the hardware and the instruments are very highly optimized because everybody wants to get everything they can out of them. It means there's very low tolerance for any risks because if you only have one chance, you don't want to botch it. And it's also very high profile, which means if you do botch it, it's on the front page of a newspaper, and that really isn't something you want. You also have schedule constraints from launch windows that drive a lot of extra costs and requirements, and between all of this, they end up being very, very expensive. Now, in contrast, CubeSats, from what I've learned just watching at meetings like this in the past couple of years, you do have standards, the form factor, requirements that are basically to make sure you don't break anything with the launch vehicle or the primary payload, standard deployment system, essentially no interaction at all with primary payload. If they don't know you exist, everyone is happy. But then there are a lot of things that aren't really part of the official standards but seem to fall out of them. The very low cost, the acceptance of relatively high risk, short development cycles, frequent launch opportunities, and all of the commercial hardware that you use. Now, where I think that's gotten CubeSats is that having the standard interface really was the starting point. It saves a lot of money in development costs for developing the interface with the launch vehicle. You don't have to do this every single time. It's not a new negotiation the way I believe secondary payloads were in the 1990s. And that means you have more frequent launch opportunities. There are more variety of vehicles you can launch on. It's kind of just accepted as standard that there'll be a secondary payload with CubeSats on launches. And the fact that you're independent of these specific, you don't have these specific negotiations means there are a lot of vehicles that will take those payloads. And in a way, the form factor also helps, and the design standards also help because all of the commercial companies designing COTS parts have a target. If they're going to build a 1.5U star tracker, actually a quarter U would probably do, they know there are people who buy that. They know that's a box that people want their design to fit into. And that's all folded into this thing where you have frequent launch opportunities, That means the failure of risk isn't so bad. There are opportunities for reflight. And if you look at NASA's technical standards, almost a requirement for not doing all of the work that a major planetary mission does in risk reduction is based on one of the qualifications for accepting higher risk is that you do have reflight opportunities. Because it isn't one of a kind, I mean, there are a lot of advantages to Cox parts, but because this is not your only chance, you don't have somebody saying, oh God, it's my only chance, I really wish I could squeeze an extra instrument on, can we fiddle? And that actually means off-the-shelf parts with fixed specifications are more viable. You don't want to be customizing everything as much. Short development cycle, I don't want to say a lot about that. All of these things reduce cost, and what I think that does is it creates kind of a feedback loop that I really like. The design standards were what kicked it off by allowing these frequent launch opportunities, but then because you have frequent opportunities, you can accept risk. Because you can do that, it's low cost. Because it's low cost, you can accept risk, and it all gets into a cycle where you're evolving very quickly to have a lot of opportunities at low cost. Now, in contrast to that, major planetary missions get into this loop in the opposite direction. There are few opportunities, so they can't take risks. To avoid the risks, things become very expensive. That drives you to use custom parts. That makes it more expensive. And because everything is now more complicated, more expensive, there are even fewer opportunities, and you just go round and round in here. So in light of that, I kind of think of planetary nanosatellites as distinct from cube satellites in three categories. One is a CubeSat where you are in this sort of frequent opportunity, low cost, risk acceptance paradigm. Something where what I'd call a Class AB, which is a NASA term, I'm sorry, I should have looked up the appropriate ESA or UK Space Agency term. Where you're doing small sats, you have a lot of the advantages of small satellites on planetary mission, but you're doing it in the framework of the current standards of planetary missions. And I think the distinction between those two is very important. And also, another category would be what I call sub-spacecraft, which are probably Class AB, not necessarily, but they're really an integral part of a larger mission, as opposed to a standalone spacecraft, which is what CubeSats tend to be. Okay, in terms of what I'm calling the Class AB nanosatellites, yeah, no matter what you do, planetary launch opportunities are going to be rare, so there are going to be those concerns about reliability and chances of failure and so on. But also, a lot of these concepts rely on tagging along with a larger mission, either for telecommunications or for hitching a ride. We heard how difficult it could be to go all the way to an asteroid that's pushing the limits. What was that, a 12U, I think? But also, if you are hitching a ride, there's some issues I don't hear discussed very much. You'd be potentially sitting off inside the deployer for months on end, and nobody talks about whether or not that means the spacecraft you're riding on has to worry about your thermal environment. Your batteries aren't going to stay charged for, well, maybe 6 months, but not for longer cruises. And the primary mission might impose its own requirements on the way the CubeSat is developed. Now, there are also cases where just the environment, radiation, duration, whatever, might require you to drop some of the standardization from CubeSat lines. This whole thing means you still have the benefits that are associated with small spacecraft on planetary mission, like being able to do multi-point measurements, getting on trajectories or in observing geometries that just are not favorable for a larger mission. But it is fundamentally a high-cost, rare opportunity approach, which is why even though I see that called CubeSats a lot. From what I've learned about it, I really don't think that's what made CubeSats such a big deal in the past 15 years or so, terrestrial CubeSats. Sub-spacecraft actually have an incredibly long history going back to the particle and field subsatellites left in lunar orbit by a couple of the Apollo missions. The historical ones are generally larger, but these are spacecraft where probably they're going to match the risk posture and development schedule of a major mission, but they're also going to be tied to the mission goals. They're part of the mission. It's not like they're selected separately, or I just need a ride to Mars to do something interesting. Can you get my 3U spacecraft there? So, I mean, in some ways, I even think of those as not a separate spacecraft, a separate mission, but more an instrument on that mission that happens to be free flying. Okay, for what I actually call CubeSats, 5 minutes. I mean, the advantage there, the two advantages as I see it, are that first of all, planetary missions are getting more and more specialized, even the big ones, like the Europa Clipper. Its science goals are all focused on habitability notions of Europe. The instruments that were selected, to be selected, they had to be relevant to that. And that means there's a lot of important science, a lot of goals that aren't a whole big mission work. They don't fit into this approach of dedicating a big mission to doing something particular. And CubeSats give an opportunity to do small focused add-ons on this particular question. The other is, I just don't think the high-cost, low-risk approach is terribly efficient. This isn't anything new. I finally dug up enough numbers that I think I'm not making them up. But the fact is, cube rates, despite being risk tolerant, have, a 60-odd% chance of working at least. They're getting much better than that recently. The low-risk missions historically don't do a lot better than 90%, but cost at least twice as much. And if you think of a whole program rather than one individual mission, well, if you do it with the CubeSat style approach, you might try 20 times and have it work 12. If you take the traditional approach, same budget, you'll only be able to try 10 times. That should be 9, not a 6. So, 9 successes versus 12. You're still winning with the high-risk approach just because you're trying more often. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to speed up. I think if you want the CubeSat approach with primary mission, you either have to be completely independent, which is really hard in terms of antenna time, downlink, propulsion, navigation. 12 million I saw them navigate a mission independently in an earlier talk today. So if you aren't going to do it completely independently, I believe everything you're doing needs to be very, very standardized so that it's just something you can add to a larger mission without them having to worry about you. That's really what made CubeSats work at Earth. Launch windows, that's actually, I'll skip that entirely. A good question is what kind of frequency you need, because I'm saying that this works if you have frequent opportunities. And, some targets are going to be a problem. Pluto is not, you're not going to get a secondary payload to Pluto anytime soon. But in the case of Mars, there have been 12 successful missions in the past 20 years. 3 of them actually had secondary spacecraft, although only one of them worked. And if you could do something like simply make a completely transparent interface to the major missions and have the space agencies mandate 24 CubeSats delivered on each mission, that's a 5% or less tax on their mass budget. Standardize the relay. Would averaging about 15 U worth of spacecraft to Mars be frequent enough to get into that kind of feedback loop I described? Well, I already said all this, so I'll just stop there and say, I don't know, does this make any sense to people that are more familiar with CubeSats than with planetary science?
We have time for questions.
Hi Frank, I'm not, I'm more a planetary scientist like you than a CubeSat person, but it seems to me to make sense to sort of differentiate these different classes because there's different constraints on all these. One thing that I thought of, and I don't know how it fits into the sort of paradigms that you presented here, is that the planetary or interplanetary is different than Earth, because on Earth, when you're designing a spacecraft, you can almost imagine numerous rides in standard orbits, whether they're polar or geosync or something like that. So you don't have to really think about that too much. You can just assume I'm going to build this and I know what that environment's going to be, and off you go for the most part. When you're going interplanetary, let's say to Mars or even to the moon or things, these are one-offs. You don't have a standard design like you would for Earth orbit, because your thermal environment, your radiation environment, your time, all this stuff is going to, the amount of power you need, the thrust, the orbits, all this stuff is going to be one-offs, unique. And that seems to also drive the cost, even if you want to go with the low-risk approach. And I think that's a big discriminator between low-risk Earth and even low-risk interplanetary.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be an issue. I've thought, for example, when you're hitching a ride to Mars, the major mission you're getting a ride with might be a lander, it might be an orbiter, it might be going into a high eccentric orbit for aerobraking. You probably would need some amount of independent propulsion to get you where you want to go, because you won't. It's not like you can say, put me on the next sun-synchronous 200-kilometer orbit. You'll have to maneuver into that, but at least you can get to Mars hitching a ride.
I really like your talk. It was nice, planetary scientist view of things. A few things I'd like to add, if you don't mind. So one is, the reason we stuck with the CubeSat form factor as long as we have is miniaturization is incredibly expensive. And there have been several NASA initiatives to start from scratch and miniaturize a type of spacecraft that have failed miserably. So by using CubeSats, we're able to exploit hundreds of groups around the world to develop stuff, and then we only need one unique piece to finish it off. Secondly, I think you underestimate the number of missions that use Venus gravity assists. There are a lot planned, so that's an opportunity to use nanosat and CubeSat technology more often. And then the third thing, your stat on failure rates is distorted. Like most stats are, obviously. By the time most people start off in that first CubeSat is 30 to 50% likely to fail, or even more. But by the time they get to their third or fourth, the stats collected by Aerospace and SpaceWorks suggest that the failure rate is comparable to the mainstream missions.
I was actually using the numbers from a recent US Academy of Sciences study. You're correct. They said CubeSats tend to be 60 or 70%. What NASA calls Class CD are about 80%. And actually, a lot of people with experience building CubeSats are working closer to the CD standard. I picked the numbers I did because that is the least favorable comparison for the CubeSat approach, and it still comes out better.
So I want to comment on your classifications in the sense that you have one that I think really is a redefining capability, and that is this idea of developing a generic form factor that you can apply broadly. I think that is going to be more difficult to do as an add-on to more expensive missions, but as an independent exploring tool, something that you can adapt for different mission styles. So it doesn't have to be a one-off. You can design an entire class that would go just to Mars, or an entire class that would go just to the orbital Venus. or an entire class that is optimized for the asteroid belt. And being able to repetitively fly and go to those locations hugely expands the discovery space in a way that larger, more expensive missions simply can't do. And I really think that's the key capability that you're really describing.
And I think the degree of standardization is important because if you had to do it from scratch for every major mission you were riding along with, and it was a whole new negotiation for every CubeSat, you couldn't, for example, build a CubeSat designed to go to Mars and say, oh, I'm behind schedule, bump me to the next launch window, because now you're negotiating with a whole new mission.
So your message seems to be that using CubeSats is going to give you a higher success rate, so that should be primarily adopted. The concern that comes with that is the long-term reliability, right? So we saw this today morning. So which might be the concern for space agencies and stuff. So how do you address that?
Well, I guess my main point was simply that there is a distinction between these different types of nanosatellites, and you want to pick the one that makes sense. And I put in a lot of editorial opinion about which one I think makes sense. But there are issues there. The high failure rate, if it's bad publicity and gives the agency a black eye, then that might not be something they want, even though it's the more cost-effective way of accomplishing the science. So there are additional factors that have to be considered. I think if it's a small enough add-on and it's separate enough from a primary mission, that might not be a concern, but it's something to talk about.
Yeah, so I think the policy which you're recommending of trying to have a 24U on every launch, I think that's certainly an ideal scenario. It probably won't be the realistic scenario because even if there are frequent Venus gravity assists or transfers to L2, other different mission profiles, it would be very difficult for agencies to reserve that amount of mass and mandate that, but I think perhaps we can also recommend to have that at least assessed on a case-by-case basis, because some large missions won't have that mass margin available at all, simply because the way they're designed. You won't get anywhere near that with the project manager to release the margin until if it does exist.
Well, the Mars orbiters already have a mandate to do telecom relays for the landers. 24 might not be the correct number. It's, as I said, under 5%. I checked what that would be for Maven, which is a smaller end of Mars mission, and that was about 4.5% of the dry mass. So I don't think that's inconceivable. It would be a policy decision handed down to the project managers. There's no major mission project manager that would volunteer for this. Volunteering for CubeSats that were closely integrated in part of the mission, what I was calling sub-spacecraft, that could very well happen. But we have 24U arrives, we're going to have a separate selection, just make room for them. That's going to have to be a management mandate, not a project decision.
A last word.
I think that in terms of the capacity that's available on, say, the Mars mission on Atlas V, is down to mostly primarily whether NASA will allow anything near that spacecraft. Because the capacity is there, all you need to do is put on an extra SRB, you might have to put on a 5-meter fairing or a plug on top underneath the fairing. But if you put an extra SRB on, you've got an extra 1,000 kilograms of throw weight to Mars. And that it's just down to whether or not NASA will allow you to do that at there's plenty of capacity.
Well, there is a dollar cost associated with that, but yeah, I mean, it's not a technical limit, I don't believe, but
It's there if
Yeah.
people are prepared to pay.
okay, I'll agree with that.
Great stuff. Well, of course, the whole point of this talk was to give you something to talk about over dinner. So I hope you'll all be coming at 7 o'clock, Darwin College. Thank you very much.